My name is Dario Hasenstab. I have a degree in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. Every fifth episode of this podcast, we will go through the news of the past month and relate to our analysis of our past recordings. If you, as our listeners, encounter any articles relevant to our content, we would be grateful for you to share them with us at thewesternbubble@gmail.com. In this week's episode, we will specifically talk about the United Kingdom and Liz Truss, the Netherlands and immigration, the protests in Iran, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Starting with the United Kingdom, especially simply because it relates so well to to our episode 12 that we did, especially on the United Kingdom. After we published this episode, Liz Truss announced unfunded tax cuts that very much benefited the rich rather than the poor. This sent the pound sterling into a nosedive and panicked the markets. This contributes to a dark cloud on the United Kingdom housing market, with homeowners increasingly struggling to pay their mortgages. Boulder, our concerns that we expressed in the episode on the United Kingdom became reality much faster than expected.
Yes, it was surprising. You had 10 days of mourning for the death of Queen Elizabeth, and within a week after that, the first essentially operational week for Prime Minister Liz Truss, she managed to crash the pound and make international markets lose further faith in the United Kingdom. It was a show to behold from the outside, but of course it has very serious consequences. And this is exactly what you get when, as we put it in the episode on the United Kingdom, you have a manager without the intellectual depth necessary to understand or to fully engage in the complexity of governance, but a manager who has very deep intuitive ideological leanings, and the consequences are clear.
Yeah, I remember when we recorded the episode on the United Kingdom, I felt like after recording we were very harsh with Liz Truss, and I thought, oh, let's give her a chance. I mean, yes, she doesn't strike us as the leader that that you might need in a situation like this, but the fact that, and we were recording this on October 3rd, the fact that she took less than a month to completely basically disappoint any hopes that there could have been into this is astonishing.
Well, the thing about Liz Truss is that she's not an unknown quantity, right? It's not as if we started paying attention to her now that she's become prime minister. She was foreign secretary before under Boris Johnson, did a pretty bad job at it. She didn't seem to actually recognize sufficiently the seriousness of her position. She started saying things that she shouldn't be saying as foreign secretary. She didn't go down well with partners during negotiations. And on top of that, she is someone who has been quite consistent in her very boneheaded, if you like, ideological approach to what the UK government should be doing. And she even wrote a book with her current Chancellor of the Exchequer about 10 years ago. I haven't read it, but a book basically laying out a very Thatcherite, dark vision for how she views the United Kingdom.
Exactly, and so kind of relating to Thatcher and Reagan, this reminds us of this concept of starving the beast, right? Where, yeah,
Yeah, it is. So there are a number of things to take into account here. First of all, let's be clear: Thatcherite or Reaganomics has been thoroughly debunked by now. Yes, you can have a conversation about how high taxes should go or how low taxes should go. If you agree that at least taxes should be at a minimum 1% and at a maximum 100%, then we've got a conversation about where in the middle we find each other. There's a serious conversation to be had. But this idea that automatically cutting taxes is going to be good for the economy because it grows a magical pie that then everyone benefits from, right? The idea is that everyone will eat more pie even if your slice is smaller in relative terms, but you will benefit from a growing economy, has turned out to be complete nonsense and has led to very significant poverty issues within the Western world, within that Western bubble. And then on top of that, you've got people like Liz Truss who actually have a deep cynicism towards government. And that's where starving the beast comes in. Namely, the idea that we are going to have unfunded tax cuts, we are going to implement all kinds of measures that are going to put significant pressure on government finances in the medium and long term. So 10 years down the road, at some point, London will not be able to pay its bills anymore, essentially. And that will then force us to shrink the government. That will force us to cut social welfare, to cut expenditure on the NHS, or to privatize the NHS. Do all those kinds of things that maybe now politically are still difficult to accomplish. They will be needed later on because we have set a mechanism in motion that will starve the government from money. And then the only outcome will be a smaller government. This is what they're driving at. And this is exactly the opposite of what Western countries need right now. We have been cutting government engagement with society over the past 30 years, and it's led to very significant problems. And again, this is not coming from someone who is some kind of raving communist or socialist. This is just logical, looking at statistics, looking at where we have been going over the past decades. This has nothing to do with socialist or left-wing ideology. This is just reasonable analysis saying a Western society, a liberal democracy without a relatively strong government is going to fail in the long term, is going to collapse, and you're going to have masses of poor people taking their pitchforks to the rich and throwing them out of their mansions.
Exactly, because I mean, we discussed this partly in the episode, the fall of U.S. foreign policy, where you already see these effects, especially in California, with the homeless crisis, and we have talked about this in the UK episode, where we mentioned that 20% of all British children, or I see, I'm not sure whether it was children or Brits in general, are now in poverty.
Yeah, of total population. This is according to government statistics, right? This is not some kind of academic somewhere coming up with a weird formula. The government themselves on their website acknowledge that 1 in 5 British people lives in poverty. That is a huge indictment for a country that has been growing its GDP, that has been growing the pie, right? That's the Reaganomics idea, that has been growing the economy further and further for decades now. But clearly it is not working for large segments of the population.
Yeah, and so the reaction to this was, I mean, first I think it was the markets that reacted. First, the pound sterling nosedived, as I explained earlier. But people were also really upset. I think that the number was more or less that a low income family maybe had 20 pounds more at the end of the month, and then an upper class family a lot more.
At the end of the year, £20. So the announcement was this is going to benefit everyone, but those on the poorer spectrum would get £20 roughly a year extra. It depends on your personal situation, of course, and there's a lot of variety. But on average, the poorest groups would get £20 a year extra, whereas the richest more than £10,000 a year extra. That is not the kind of tax cut, first of all, that you need in a country where there is already such significant poverty. But secondly, that from an economics perspective, and this would even go 1980s, Reagan economists would agree with this, those tax cuts for the rich don't do much because their marginal spending is not going to go up a lot. So you give them more money, they're going to invest it in further shares. They're not going to spend it on another microwave or on a car. They have enough of that. If you want to make the pie bigger, if you want to grow the economy, you need to make sure that there is higher disposable income in the hands of lower and middle class families. And that's not what these tax cuts did. So it was such an ideologically driven, badly thought out plan that it's not a surprise that one trader said, maybe this has been written by more people, but at least I saw one trader being quoted saying, now the government is paying a moron premium on their interest rate. So they have to pay a little bit more on their debt because we don't believe that they're actually capable, competent people in charge of finances in London. And as a result, international markets will ask the UK government to pay more than they would ask, for example, the German government, simply because they believe that the German government is more competent than the British government.
Yeah, so we observed 5 days, well, at least in the United Kingdom, 5 days of outrage. Liz Truss was nowhere to be seen. I remember, I mean, for me, it was a little bit of a side note. The pound sterling is doing a nosedive. I feel like in general, outside the United Kingdom, there wasn't such a big reaction to this, right?
I was amazed when I spoke. I had class at university, and I spoke to my students about it. Shout out to IE. most didn't actually know what was going on in the UK. It surprised me because we're still talking about the sixth largest economy. And we're still talking about a country that's incredibly influential in geopolitics, not like the United States or not like China, but they're up there in the second rankings, right? And so it surprises me that people weren't more engaged with what was happening there.
For me, I, I mean, I don't remember the exact moment when the news broke, but it felt like another breaking news item in a long line of the United Kingdom struggling. I mean, it started right after they announced Brexit with supermarket shelves being empty. Then you had the lorry truck driver crisis. So it just felt like, one crisis on top of another, and ooh, it just doesn't feel like the United Kingdom is that relevant anymore. Maybe this is just me saying this as a European because they're no longer part of the European Union, but it doesn't feel like the United Kingdom is relevant.
I think that's fair. It's not just that the UK has lost a lot of relevance for going into Brexit. We talked about this in that episode on the United Kingdom, that Brexit meant that the UK would be less influential on the world stage. I think it's also a part of a very long-term decline of the UK, and people are sort of getting used to it now. If this were to happen, if this had happened in Germany, everyone would say, "How can this happen in Germany?" But this, or Switzerland, or any country that we associate with relatively stable governance. But UK has done so many crazy things over the past 2 decades, really, that at some point we've become used to it, and it sort of goes off our radar screen. But as we discussed, the United Kingdom is in many ways the symbol of that Western bubble, and the decaying United Kingdom should be a warning for every Western nation, right? This is what happens when you no longer have rational policy making going on and it all becomes ideological. Brexit was ideological based on some supposed glorious imperial past that no longer exists. Um, the Tory management over the past decade has been mostly ideological, not based on proper economic or social analysis of what's going on. Western societies have very, very deep problems. And if you think that tax cuts, unfunded tax cuts, especially to the rich, is gonna somehow make things better, then you're completely deluded.
And so the reaction to this again was 5 days of wide anger, and there was no reaction from Liz Truss because she was nowhere to be seen. And then
Gone,
when
gone.
and then when she finally spoke to the people, she did this by basically touring local radio stations, giving them each 5 minutes of glory. And this ties very nicely into what we discussed last week on the media episode, where usually journalists are kind of constrained by this institutionalized aspect that they need to maintain a good relationship to the politicians in order to kind of get fed breadcrumbs once in a while on an interesting story. But Paulder, because you brought this up to me, what happened in these 5 minute bits with these local radio hosts?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think the thought process must have been somewhere in Downing Street, someone saying, well, if we do a half-hour interview on the Today program or on the BBC, on national BBC, then that's going to be tough because half an hour answering questions is going to be really hard. If we do 8 5-minute shows on local radio, Liz Truss can just repeat the same talking points over and over again and we'll be fine, right? That must be the thought process. But what in reality happened was exactly as you just said. These local radio hosts, they will never see Liz Truss in their lives. They don't need to maintain any personal relations with Liz Truss. They don't need any favors from the government. They don't mind being disliked by the government. They can just do their thing. And boy, did they do their thing. I mean, they just went after her like pit bulls. And Liz Truss, at some point, she just fell completely silent. She didn't know what to say anymore because this is not the kind of journalism that is that she has experience with. This is not what she hears from Laura Kunzberg, for example, who she did an interview with this weekend, which was much more polite, if you like, and less critical in tone. And the result is that these local radio stations showed us exactly what we should expect from media. Not that those 5 minute segments were particularly useful in terms of content because Liz Truss didn't have much to say, but the fact that she didn't have much to say is important information for the news, right? The fact that she didn't have an answer to those critical questions gives the country information about where she's at, where the government is at. Not every interview needs to be deeply content laden. If the person being interviewed is basically winging it. And unfortunately, national radio and national TV don't fulfill that same journalistic duty because they need to maintain this good balance, this personal relationship with politicians.
Mm. And then overall, this entire situation is just a very good example of the long term decay of the United Kingdom.
And an example of how the elites, and I don't like using that word sometimes because it gets used by populists like the elites, but those people who form the policy making bubble, rich donors, media, major media outlets, politicians, how they are completely out of touch with reality, right? Local radio stations, they actually are talking to local people phone in, and they're not these major celebrities. Local journalists can walk down the street and nobody recognizes them, so they are more in touch with what happens on the ground. You've got a decaying society, but it seems that there's this bubble of policymakers and intellectual as well as financial elites that not don't really understand. They hear people are in trouble. They see some statistics about poverty. They hear that there are long queues in front of food banks, but it doesn't really enter their psyche. It doesn't really enter their own psychology because they live in their own comfortable middle class environment. And that has been very clearly exposed here. Now today, on the day of recording, they've kind of done a U-turn, um, at least on the top rate income tax, which was only a very small part of the unfunded budget, so it doesn't actually solve many long-term problems. That is that's a symbolic gesture, but the long-term policy making does not seem to recognize that very deep decay that is occurring in our Western societies.
And so what we observe here is kind of this path from 2015, from the voting, from the referendum of Brexit to then actual Brexit happening, all the way over here. And so what are the long term dynamics that are in place here?
Well, in many ways, I think the United States and the UK are the canary in the coal mine, right? They should be a sign to the whole Western world of what we should not do, the mistakes we should not make. And in the UK, it has clearly been accelerated because of Brexit, because they don't have any checks and balances from the outside anymore. At least the European Union, think whatever you like about the EU, but the EU does moderate extreme policy making. The EU creates checks and balances that no longer exist in the UK, and that means that a government like the current government in London can just do whatever they like, however destructive that is to their own population.
So a country that still does have European checks and balances is the country where you were born, the Netherlands. And to my shame, I have to admit, I do not regularly keep up with the Netherlands, but you wanted to talk about it this week. Why is that?
I'm shocked, Dario, that you don't keep up with the Netherlands. You should. It's much more important than you think. What happened in the Netherlands many things happened in the Netherlands over the past 2 months, but most importantly, the Dutch government proposed a new set of measures to stem immigration. Immigration is a very hot topic at the moment, and it has been a very hot topic for quite a while in the Netherlands. And the plan that the government put forward was to make it much harder to reunite families of refugees or asylum seekers. So you have a parent, a mother or a father who has been accepted as a refugee or an asylum seeker in the Netherlands. Then now it's becoming, according to these measures, much harder for the children to follow that parent. So to reunite the family. Beyond the basic morality of this, there are lots of legal obstacles, which we'll discuss in a moment, I'm sure. But for me, this is just another sign of observing my home country, my parental country, slide into darkness. I haven't lived in the Netherlands for roughly 26 years now. And I lived there for the first 18 years of my life and then went to study in the United Kingdom. And I remember when in the United Kingdom, I was a student walking around. I was quite happy, comfortable talking about the Netherlands as a country that had a pretty good balance about being open to the world, being liberal in terms of not too much government intervention, but still also social in the way that they protected the vulnerable in society, etc., etc. It seemed to me a country that was modern, that had the right approach to things. And over these past 26 years, as an outsider, I'm seeing it year in, year out, sliding into some kind of dark moral place where the approach is becoming hyper conservative towards outsiders, where there is this populist extremist movement against immigrants and against the rest of the world, where the Netherlands is closing itself off and pretending that its problems are caused by those outsiders, whereas in reality, the number of immigrants going into the Netherlands is much lower than in many moments in the 20th century. Immigrants are absolutely not the reason why there are certain problems. For example, there's a housing crisis in Amsterdam that is not because of immigrants, but it's being put onto immigrants, right? And weirdly enough, crazily enough, at the same time that there's this anti-immigration movement in the Netherlands becoming stronger and stronger, there is a huge shortage of workers in the Netherlands, which, yeah, from a policy perspective, seems to contradict itself, right? If you have lots of sectors, industries that desperately require workers, and we're not talking about overly, hugely skilled workers like university degrees or anything like that, just basic workers, the Netherlands needs them. If you see that and at the same time you're closing your borders, something is wrong with you. Something is going horribly badly.
See, that's interesting because while I do not necessarily keep up with the Netherlands in the news, I did talk about the Netherlands in class. So I'm currently taking a class on cultural policy. And one of the aspects of cultural policy is education. That's one of the bigger fields where either through sending your own students abroad or receiving a lot of exchange students at home at your universities is becoming like a very big policy field. And the Netherlands is a country that's very strong in that. There's a lot of courses being offered in English, and especially in policy areas, because a lot of my current colleagues have studied in the Netherlands for their bachelor's degree. However, in this class about cultural policy, we recently discussed that the country is actually taking a step back from this. Is instead of welcoming young students in, it's more going back to offering courses in Dutch instead of English because of okay, to be honest, I can't really assess this, but I would say a perceived, or at least a perceived loss of culture, that nobody is speaking Dutch anymore. And I think that this fits into what you described, is that there's a problem being put on outsiders, on newcomers, that maybe isn't the biggest problem. I mean, we've talked about this in the past a lot, where instead of talking about the actual problem, solving the actual problems, you kind of engage in battles that aren't necessarily important as a matter of fact, but more of a personality thing, or a country's personality thing.
Absolutely, and it's a huge change with respect to the Netherlands that I grew up in, where in the Netherlands of the 1980s, 1990s prided itself in not being overly nationalistic, not waving the flag, being open to other. I loved the fact that it was advanced with respect to its English. Now there's sort of this movement back to, oh no, we have to speak more Dutch, like you said, but in the universities. There's this sense that somehow the Netherlands needs to close its doors, which goes very much against its whole DNA, right? We can have, and I'm sure we will in the future, have conversations about the neo-colonial or the colonial past of the Netherlands. But in essence, the Netherlands is a trading nation, and a trading nation means that you're connected to the world. And that kind of sentiment is disappearing and is being replaced by a sense of our world is very scary. The world around us is a danger. Things are going badly with respect to the environment, with respect to economic upheaval and all that. We have to close our gates. We have to protect what we have at all cost. We're a small country and we're very rich, and we have to keep that wealth for ourselves. Whereas a lot of the problems that you would like to solve if you're the Netherlands are actually things that require sacrifice from the inside, have nothing to do with the outside world, have much more to do with how you behave. For example, I'm someone who lives in Madrid. In Madrid, everyone, rich and poor, live in apartments. So even though Spain has a lot of land, much more land available than the Netherlands, people live in much more efficient ways. In the Netherlands, you would then hear, no, 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 but I want my garden and I want my. So Dutch people have this lifestyle that they're unwilling to sacrifice, unwilling to give up, even though that's absolutely necessary if you want to, for example, deal with the housing crisis. The Netherlands is a very small geographical country, but they're not willing to do that. Instead, they look for symbolism. And that symbolism is, let's blame foreigners, let's blame immigrants, and let's make it really hard for immigrants to come into our society. Whereas your example is a perfect case of where it is actually really good policy to let foreign students come to your country. These are students, these are young, well-educated people. Some of them will stay, others will go back and will like to trade and do business with you in the Netherlands if they go back to their home countries. It makes a lot of practical, logical sense to let outside students come in. But of course, that then is more difficult to explain to the masses. It's more difficult to explain at a political level. It's a bit more complex because our world is complex, and instead we just act as if they're annoying outsiders who are taking resources away from us. And this has been a very clear process that I have observed.
See, and on that point that you just mentioned, how connected you feel to the country where you studied in. I mean, I think I'm a very good example of this because I studied for 4 years in Spain, and my love for that country is eternal. And I either definitely will come back and want to work there, aka pay my taxes, or at some point I will want to have a job where hopefully I will be working very closely together with Spaniards.
And,
But then,
and if you were to come back to Spain, brilliant, because Spain needs people like you, obviously. Valio, every country needs people like you. Duh. But even if you weren't to come back, you are much more likely, let's say that you go into government, or let's say that you go into business, you're much more likely to be open to working with Spain, which would be hugely advantageous to Spain, right? It's not difficult to comprehend. It just requires politicians to lay out a little bit more of a complex narrative rather than the simplistic us versus them idea.
and so how was this different in the 1990s? Because I mean, these policies, I want to call them open door policies. They must have originated in some period or at some point.
Yeah, so what is very interesting here is that I remember in the years before I left, there was a very small party called the Centrum Democrats, Centrum Democraten in Dutch. A very small party in the Netherlands that were on the fringe, were the extreme right at that time. At most, if I remember correctly, they got 2 seats in parliament in one election and then they lost them again. 2 seats out of 150, so a tiny fragment of the population voted for them. And they were dismissed by the whole country, essentially, as being morally wrong, morally reprehensible. These people, surely a basic tenet of any moral society is be open to outsiders, be open to your neighbor. Surely that every religion in the world, I mean, I'm not religious, but every religion in the world emphasizes the importance of opening your house to guests, right? That is such an important part of what humanity is about. So in those days, that party was morally rejected by the country, but also people understood that it just didn't make any sense what they were saying, that it was just way too simplistic rhetoric, and that those people who voted for them didn't really think things through. Those were people who weren't happy with how things were going, but they didn't really understand or didn't want to understand the actual potential solutions. Instead, it was much easier to just blame people with a different skin color, for example. Fast forward 10 years later and now to 2022, and that language that was rejected so thoroughly by the Netherlands in the 1990s is now the language of mainstream politicians, not the extreme fringe. I mean, the extreme parties have many more seats in parliament, but even just the mainstream government parties use language that is very reminiscent of the language used by those extremes in the 1990s. So sort of the extreme from 25 years ago has now become mainstream, and that should scare all of us. And I follow the Dutch news through mostly teletext and a few Dutch newspapers.
What is that? You have to explain that
Good
to
old
well,
teletext
not
is
to
the
me. I know this about you, but to the younger generation.
it's the best form of news communication. Just the way we did it before the internet. You just click on a page on your TV. You know, we had like internet before the internet on TV, and there it would then have the news, and you click on 101, and you get everything that's happening in the world on one small page. Anyway, very practical. I can recommend it to everyone, but I think that the Netherlands is one of the last countries that has it. I know, for example, that in the UK they've done away with it. It's brilliant. People should really try it out. I read before anything in newspapers. I read about an opinion poll a month ago or so, and it was in reaction to this government plan of making reunification of immigrant families more difficult. And the news item was 61% of the population supports it. So then I started looking into it, and I read more about it, and I thought, and my reaction was, oh yeah, I knew it was bad, but it's a shame that it is this bad. That 61% of the population believes that this kind of insanely strict anti-immigration policy is both moral somehow, or people just don't care about morality anymore, I don't know, and somehow is actually solving anything. So I was depressed by that. But I thought, well, at least 39%, you know, maths, 39% of the population still, you know, is still principled and still understands that this is not where the solutions lie. But then I looked into it, and it turned out that of the remaining 39%, only 6% was actually saying that it should be less strict. The rest was actually believed that it wasn't strict enough. So for me, that was like a shattered dream of how can I still be Dutch? How can I still have a passport from this country that not only has apparently completely forgotten about basic morality and the basic responsibility we all have about the world we live in, but secondly has forgotten about practical solution finding, about solutions to the real problems rather than lame and empty symbolic rhetoric that actually doesn't accomplish anything except that it leads to human hardship all around the world, right? It was just a very depressing kind of moment for me where I thought, yeah, I really have very little in common with this country anymore, and it's so sad to have seen it slide in this direction. And for me, that it's a very good example of how we start more and more building up this bubble around us of a decaying society.
And I mean, so there's obviously like a bigger picture reason why we're talking about this topic, and specifically because we said just a few minutes ago that you do no longer have these European Union checks and balances in the UK. However, you do still have them in the Netherlands, luckily. I mean, maybe there will be an exit soon. But so then, luckily, I mean, yes, I would say we can say luckily the European Union that intervened.
Yes, exactly. So straight away, when the government presented this, there were both scholars from within the Netherlands, legal analysts, and the European Union who said, hang on, this goes against basic human rights. We did an episode about basic human rights, and we know that the EU has integrated some of the principles of human rights into their own lawmaking. The Netherlands has as well. So people both within the Netherlands said, hang on, this goes against the basic legal system that we've put in place. And the European Union said, if you internally don't solve this, then we as the European Union have a problem with this, because this is not how you're allowed to run your country anymore. Rightfully so, right? And so this is a good case where you have the Netherlands being limited in its extreme behavior by broader mechanisms. And that's very good. That's a good thing.
And so this kind of goes back to our third episodes on the hollowing out of institutions, where we already found out that a lot of the good foundations of Western society come from the 19th and 20th century, and this is one of those. Like, you know, there's like these checks and balances there, and a lot of the newer developments from the 21st century are not necessarily as healthy.
That's exactly right. So we've got, in many ways, a society that is riding off the coattails of the previous generations, and I'm not saying that this current generation, we as a society right now, are doing everything wrong. There are lots of things we do really well, of course. But over the past 150 years, you see a clear evolution of this Western society building up slowly and not perfectly. It never was perfect, not even in the 1990s, but slowly over time, building up strong pillars on which you can grow and on which you can prove to history that Western liberal democracy is actually worthwhile, is actually something that offers practical solutions as well as, if you like, moral solutions to the world. And many of the things that are still going well nowadays in our societies are because of that. Whereas at the same time, the 21st century is chiseling away at those foundations, is slowly eroding the 20th century foundations. And the immigration crisis talk, and we should ask ourselves, crisis, what crisis? The only crisis is because we make it a crisis, not because there are all of a sudden millions and millions of immigrants more going into Europe. In fact, there are fewer immigrants going into Europe than most of the 20th century, or second half of 20th century. This immigration crisis talk is a really good example of that, where we are forgetting about the society we were building up, and we're just starting to undermine the basic foundations of that society.
Moving on to the next topic we want to discuss, protests have erupted in Iran following the death of a young woman in moral police custody that have started 2 weeks ago. The government reacted uncompromisingly and forcefully putting down protests and imposed internet restrictions. I think it's important to mention that all of this was about this woman not wearing her hijab properly, and then the moral police basically arresting her in police custody. She then died. And I think here, I mean, we can obviously rate this a little bit to our episode number 2, where we talked about Iran in general, while we focused more on the Iran nuclear deal, and to the media episode from last week, because, and this is actually the part I want to start with, what has annoyed me a lot is that every time the media mentions the moral police, that they put it in quotation marks, or they say the so-called moral police. And this to me is just, it's immediately framing it, right?
This is what the Western media does. It puts moral in quotation marks because it wants to show that they know who is right and who is wrong. And the idea that the moral police can actually be moral in any way, can show any morality, is rejected by Western media. Whereas, of course, this is a very gray area, and it's not up to reporters, up to journalists to decide who is right and who is wrong here. It is this idea of fact-checking, which in certain cases might make sense internally, domestically. When a politician tells a lie, it's good to fact-check. Then again, lies are typically ambiguous, right? It's hardly ever possible to really pinpoint where the lie is. But certainly when it comes to something broadly ambiguous, like the moral police, which is just a name that the Iranian authorities have given this police force, in that situation, it is not up to Western media to take a stance there. They should report and they should analyze the situation. Instead, they say, haha, look how terribly backward they are, and look how delusional this regime is, and we will expose it for you.
See, this would be the same as me talking about the United States Supreme Court, and every time I mention it, I put Supreme in quotation marks. So the United States Supreme Court, kind of undermining the entire point. But then moving on more to the bigger picture, I mean, apart from the fact that obviously I'm pretty sure both of us have all the sympathies in the world for this young woman that died, and for anyone who's expressing their feelings in protests, what I'm seeing very critically here is that immediately, and this kind of goes back to the episode 13 we did on Ukraine and the media, where we criticize that immediately the Western media speculates about Putin falling or there's regime change happening in Russia. This exact same happens here. So it's the coverage of the protests goes very quickly from a young woman died. This is not good. She died in police custody for these reasons. And it turns very quickly to, oh, these protests are growing and they have the potential to seriously alter the regime in Iran. And this is then done without actually like kind of questioning what this would entail, what this means. It very quickly goes into, we don't like this regime and it needs to be gone.
Well, because it is based on this foundational intuitive idea that's deeply ingrained in the West, and certainly in Western media, is that all those regimes, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, are all about to be toppled over. They're all about, if it weren't for those pesky dictators in charge, or Ayatollah in the case of Iran, then Iran would be a thriving liberal democracy like us. So we're just waiting for the moment for that to happen. Whereas in reality, of course, let's say, which I don't believe it's necessarily very likely, but let's say that tomorrow the current government and the current state of Iran would fall. That doesn't mean that that automatically leads to a liberal Western Eurocentric kind of government apparatus. Iran will choose its own path, and yet we perceive those moments of crisis in Russia, in Iran, and elsewhere as moments that we're very close to liberal democracy because that's what we know to be the best. That's what we think is the solution for humanity. And the obstacle is apparently just a few people at the top, and society is hungry to be free. Well, newsflash, Iranian society will not in any way want to copy the Netherlands or the United Kingdom or Spain the moment that the Ayatollah leaves office. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And it is a shocking example of our bubble mentality, right? Where we can't see through that. And it very much, by the way, reminds me, you're a bit maybe too young for that, but of the Arab Spring in 2011, which where all of a sudden in the Middle East and in the Maghreb region, there were these movements, these populist movements to overthrow authoritarian regimes. Tunisia was at the forefront, but there were Egypt as now. There were a lot of, and the West jumped on it, and NGOs and governments started funding all these civil society movements. Western newspapers and CNN were talking about it for weeks in a row. Look, the masses rising up to freedom. Well, and look, 10 years later, what's happened? I mean, not much in the sense of it them turning into a Western liberal democracy because the world doesn't look at the West as their final solution.
See, when it comes to and here I'm going to do what the media usually does because I do this in all my essays, the so-called Arab Spring, because it's an inherently Western idea of the Arab Spring. This was an example I wanted to bring up as well because there seems to be this romanticized idea of a revolution. Well, there are very few revolutions in history that actually have turned out to be peaceful in the short term. I mean, uh, we saw it in Egypt, where yes, there were elections right after Mubarak was ousted, but then very quickly the military took over, and you have this pattern all over the place. And so this type of attitude, then the Western media, or the Western general, the Western bubble, of exactly they're just one step away from turning into a democracy, and we need to aid them. This to me is hypocritical and hurtful because it does raise these expectations of having another Arab Spring.
And then, of course, the word spring comes from the Prague Spring of 1968, which was a Cold War mentality, which was very much, again, this idea, right? Like, oh, the people on the other side of the of the divide between Western and Eastern Europe, they're about to be free, and the Prague Spring was a movement against the communist authorities, and we jumped on that. Now, that has been sort of set the tone for this idea that everywhere around the world, anyone who isn't like us is longing to be free, and it's a horrible way of perceiving the world.
See, yeah, because now I have to go back to Egypt simply because I mean throughout my studies I've looked at the Middle East a lot, and what I always what I always really liked about the elections in Egypt in 2012 is there were free democratic elections. Well, I mean according to Egyptian standards, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the party that they offered at the elections, they actually won. And this then immediately had a negative reaction in the West because the Muslim Brotherhood is something that we in the West see as something negative and something that's too much political Islam, completely ignoring that it had been a grassroots movement in Egypt for over 70 years, simply filling the void left by the government, and then people were simply voting for them that they liked the most. And then yeah, Egypt, yes, you did your democracy right, but you did it wrong because you voted for the wrong result. Like that attitude, and this is what I always want to ask people: what do you expect will happen in Iran after? It's still a predominantly very conservative country, especially religiously.
And in any case, it's not a Western country, whether it's conservative or not. It is not. it doesn't follow the European path. It doesn't follow the North American path. And that is one of the biggest errors of our Western bubble, to believe that there's one prototype of humanity, I don't know, symbolized by a young, independent, professional woman in her 30s walking around in Sweden, or walking around in Canada. And that is the type of humanity that everyone wants to follow at some point in their historical path. And of course, that is not a realistic interpretation of humanity. It's not how humanity works. Your example of Egypt in 2012 reminds me of the Palestinian authorities of 2006. So there were these elections broadly sponsored by the West, because this was the post 9/11, and the world was about to sort of reorder a little bit after the initial reaction of the war on terror and all that, and broadly supported. There were elections in the Palestinian Authority in Palestinian territories for the Palestinian legislative, that then from which then the Palestinian Authority comes. And everyone was extremely happy about, oh, look, finally Palestine is becoming a state, and they can now organize themselves, and they won't be interfered with from the outside, because they can arrange their own political and institutional system. What happens? Hamas wins those elections with a landslide. And the day after Hamas wins, the West says, yeah, but these elections are not real elections. They can't be real, because there's no way the Palestinians would vote for Hamas. There's something really off, and we cannot recognize this authority. We cannot recognize these people as the representatives of the Palestinians. Completely forgetting that in the West, we always talk about Hamas as the terrorist organization, the people fighting Israel, together with Hezbollah, shooting rockets into Israeli territory and all that kind of thing. But the reality for Palestinians was in those days that Hamas was investing in hospitals, was sponsoring social projects at home. And that's what the Palestinians saw. And so they were very happy to have leadership coming from Hamas. But the West would not recognize that, because it wasn't the image that we had created for them.
Yeah, I mean, so we did get a little bit sidetracked from Iran itself, but it does follow the same pattern. And I think then with this we can actually move on to the last topic we want to discuss today, the Russia-Ukraine war. Because over the past month, Ukraine has continued its advances against the Russian army, taking control of Liman recently. However, in the meantime, the Russian President Putin has announced a partial mobilization of reservists to counter Ukrainian efforts, and the annexation of 4 regions in eastern Ukraine. And here I'm going to talk again about what I just criticized with regards to the media coverage of Iran. Is in Iran, there were always quotation marks put on the moral police. However, when it comes to the annexation, there's always this pretext of illegal annexation.
Yeah, once again, I've read this so many times over the past week or so. Whenever the annexation gets mentioned, the journalist feels the need to put a word like that, illegal or something like that, in front of it. And take a step back. Illegal based on what exactly? International law is not really a practical tool here. It's not something we can use. Completely unrecognized by the international community, sure. We all know that this is a bit of nonsense, this annexation. It doesn't make any sense. It is basically a tool that Putin uses to strengthen his arguments, to legitimize his behavior, and to be able to say, oh, be careful, because now you're actually moving into Russian territory and we can actually defend ourselves. Whereas before it was still vaguely defined as Ukrainian territory. So from Putin's perspective, right? So it is a tool that obviously doesn't have any clear legitimacy or international support that Putin uses in the current war. Okay, fine. But it's not up to a journalist to put the word illegal there, and yet that's exactly what they do. They feel that they need to fact check this. They feel that they need to tell the reader that this isn't a real annexation. Well, but what would be a legal annexation then? Please explain that to me, and explain how that would work. If the international community, if the UN supports it, okay, not that hasn't happened many times in life. What would that actually look like? And then at least say unsupported by the United Nations or unsupported by the global community. That's fine. But the word illegal seems to suggest a factual basis that the journalist doesn't have.
So apart from the annexation, we also had then the partial mobilization, where 300,000, I think, is the number that always went around. Um, Members of the Russian reserves were mobilized to partake in the Ukraine war. What is that telling us about kind of the state of what's happening?
That Putin is in serious trouble. That Russia is in serious trouble, and this is completely obvious. The reason why so many people did not believe that Putin would actually, and the Kremlin would actually invade Ukraine, was that it was so obviously an incredibly dangerous project from a Russian selfish perspective, right? It was military strategists all around the world in January last year were saying you need at least 400,000 troops to invade Ukraine if you're Russia. And right now they only have, we're talking about February. In February, you only have 150,000 troops. So there's no way that you can invade the whole of Ukraine. And the moment, the day that Russia did invade with those limited amounts of troops, apparently overconfident of what would happen next, was the moment that you knew that Putin had made a huge mistake, a huge blunder. And this was discussed straight away. I mean, I discussed it in class with my students, and it was completely clear to anyone who was just observing and analyzing the situation is that Putin blundered. And now he's trying to he's trying to mitigate the damage by mobilizing, but that has all kinds of horrible consequences for him at home. I mean, horrible from his personal perspective because it means that his political legitimacy at home gets undermined. It actually puts a lot more emphasis on quick success because the moments those reservists are going to get killed or injured in the war is the moments that the Russians will rise up somehow, in some way. It clearly shows that this war is going very, very badly for Putin. And that in combination with the territorial gains of Ukraine over the past few weeks, and knowing that this mobilization will only have any effect, if it does have any effect, in 2 or 3 months' time, because first all those reservists have to be equipped. There are apparently not enough weapons to give to them. There's no logistical apparatus in place to actually move them to the front. It's going to take a very long time for them to get there. And knowing that a lot of young men are trying to avoid it by fleeing to other countries or by injuring themselves and that kind of thing, it is very, very clear that things are looking bleak for the Kremlin. And that is in itself good news for Ukraine, and it is good news for a global community that believes in the Westphalian system. But we have to be very, very careful here because what happens if things go right for Putin in Moscow? What happens if there's some kind of palace coup? Or what happens if there's some kind of populist uprising? Again, it's not going to turn Russia into a thriving Western liberal democracy.
And with this, going to the last part we want to cover when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, we want to talk about Zelensky because Zelensky has gotten a little bit quiet around him in the past few months. However, just this week, he openly advocated or applied for fast tracking of NATO accession.
Yeah, so what you see then in the Western bubble mentality is that journalists and politicians and the general population in general think, yeah, that's reasonable. Look, Ukraine is winning right now. I mean, the reaction would be very different if Ukraine was losing. But now everyone wants to be on the side of a winner, and it seems that Ukraine is winning, or at least winning in tactical terms. Ukraine obviously is doing very well on the front in making a lot of progress. And so the reaction is, yeah, look, Ukraine has shown that they are a strong military force. They can stand up. We have supported them. This has been a good partnership with Western weapons coming into Ukraine, and more important than weapons, by the way, Western intelligence, right? NATO intelligence about where the Russians are and what they're doing. And so it makes sense for Ukraine to integrate into that. Instead, our first reaction should be, why in heaven's name are you right now talking about integration into NATO when there is no way that you could become part of NATO while there is a conflict, open or frozen, but as long as there's a conflict with Russia, you cannot enter NATO because that would lead to World War III. That should be your first reaction. So please don't talk about that right now. Talk about it later down the line. And secondly, it shows our lack of analysis of how we got here in the first place. Look, what the West did and what NATO did was more and more putting Putin, but not just Putin, Russian strategists, Russian policymakers into a corner, building a big fence, NATO fence around Russian sphere of influence. And this goes back to the conversation we had in a previous episode about the difference between provocation and justification. Russia was never justified with respect to their invasion of Ukraine. They shouldn't have done it. It was wrong of them, and they need to be kicked out of Ukraine. But it wasn't unprovoked. NATO absolutely has been provoking the Russians. And the reason why we don't seem to understand that in the West is that we look at it from ourselves and we think we are a peaceful society. We don't want to do anything wrong to anyone. Yeah. We're building all those. We're militarizing the border around the Russian sphere of influence. We're absolutely limiting Russians' geopolitics, while we at the same time have military bases all around the world and start wars whenever we like. But we're peaceful people. We don't want to do the Russians any harm. Of course, Putin has nothing to worry about. It is this weird blindness to our own behavior on the international stage. And it is this expansion of NATO and this aggressive behavior by Western countries that certainly made it more likely for Russia to invade Ukraine. And now we're all of a sudden acting as if, yeah, it's perfectly alright, the idea to continue this process, not learning from our mistakes in the past. Next, I mean, let's assume for a second, it's not going to happen, but let's assume for a second that Ukraine were to enter NATO. What do you think China is going to do? What do you think India is going to do? Are they going to be happy about this? Of course not. They are going to look at this world and say, what is happening here? How can the West get away with these aggressive foreign policy steps over and over again?
And this seems like a great moment to end today's recap episode. If you have any questions, comments, or regards, make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western Bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
Very much in line with the Western Bubble, I thought it would be a good idea to read out the three maxims that were written on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Know thyself, nothing in excess, surety brings ruin.